This is a memory story for the essay Discuss the Psychodynamic Approach to Psychology, 16 marks. If you would like the handouts to accompany the video, you can tweet me at blonde_pretzel or click on the link in the description below. The star of this fictional story is Charlie Sheen, and each section of the story represents a paragraph in the essay.
Just before the story, this is a structure for the AO1 and AO3, and you might want to take a screenshot.
So the story starts with Charlie Sheen, who's on set when a psycho comes in and knocks him unconscious. He then tries to have sex with him because he's a psychosexual, but he finds that Charlie Sheen is an old-age pensioner who lacks genitals. So this part of the story is to represent that Freud used an iceberg as a metaphor for our minds, and that he believed that 90% of the psyche is unconscious. We don't have access to our unconscious, but it determines most of our everyday actions and behaviours, such as our food choices or who we choose to have relationships with. The psychosexual, who tried to have sex with Charlie Sheen, represents that Freud identified 5 psychosexual stages of development called oral, anal, phallic, latency and genital, and if something traumatic happened in that time, it would impact on our behaviour as adults. For example, if we were traumatised during the anal stage of development, we would have an overly controlling personality as an adult. So in the story, Charlie begins to come round, but he hallucinates he's got an angel and a devil on his shoulders. The devil tells him to beat up the psychosexual right now and to hell with all the consequences, whereas the angel tells him to forgive the psychosexual because it's the right moralistic thing to do. Then Charlie fully regains consciousness and decides to wait until an appropriate time to get his own back on the psychosexual so he won't get prosecuted. So this represents the structure of the personality. So the id is represented as the devil, as it is the selfish, greedy part that has no morals. The superego, the angel, is the overly moralistic part that feels guilty and anxiety about everything. And the ego is the part that balances out the id and the superego and identifies more appropriate behaviours to engage in or more appropriate times to do behaviours like satisfy sexual urges. So in the story, an ambulance has been called and Charlie Sheen arrives in hospital. And when he gets there, the doctor looks at his notes and says, I see you're HIV positive. And Charlie says, no, I'm not. And the doctor says, well, it says in your notes that you're HIV positive and that you identified it was probably because you slept with so many men and women. And Charlie says, well, I don't remember sleeping with loads of men and women. And he storms out, slamming the door incredibly hard on the way out. So this part of the story represents the unconscious protective devices called ego defense mechanisms. When Charlie says he's not HIV positive, it represents denial, where we refuse to accept a certain aspect of reality as true. When he says he does not remember sleeping with men and women, this represents repression, where we force hurtful, traumatic memories into the unconscious so they can't hurt us. When he slams the door on the way out, this represents displacement, where you take your hurt out on someone or something else, and all protect the psyche from pain and hurt. So in the story, as Charlie is storming out of the accident and emergency department, he bumps into Matt LeBlanc, who is dressed as an explorer for his latest film, but is actually training to be a psychoanalyst and needs a client as a case study. He asks Charlie what would make him happy, and Charlie says he's had enough of acting, which is far too introspective, but would like to try athletics and be a long jumper. Then, fast forward 5 years, and Charlie is happy from the psychoanalysis he received and loving being a long jumper. So this represents, it's the first evaluation point and represents that the psychodynamic approach was seen as a pioneering approach, which is why Matt LeBlanc is dressed as a pioneer. And that the pioneering approach veered away from introspection but used more scientific methods of study such as case studies. Freud et al. Found that you could use psychological rather than biological methods for treating mental ill health. And Maat et al. 2008 found that psychoanalysis produced significant improvements in symptoms that worked long term, which is why Matt LeBlanc uses Charlie as a case study because Freud used case studies, and Charlie said he'd had enough of acting, which was too introspective because it moved away from introspection, and that the reason it goes fast forward 5 years is because Maat et al. Found that psychoanalysis worked in the long term. So in the study, Charlie's at the athletics field doing long jump when Universal Studios FaceTime him. They offer him a part in a movie and say he should come back to acting because he's so amazing at it. But Charlie says, well, that's only your own subjective opinion. I'm not coming. The man from Universal Studios gets really angry and waves his little hands around as he tries to convince Charlie to act again. Charlie says he'll only do it if they film the movie at the North Pole. So this evaluation point criticises the case study methodology that Freud used. The Universal Studios represents that case studies are unable to provide universal theories as they are based on individuals. The Little Hands represents Little Hands case study, which was criticised for Freud's subjective opinion on what caused Little Hands to be scared of horses. So Charlie's at the North Pole and is fishing while looking at a great big green iceberg. He's confused by this, the green iceberg, and gets even more confused when he sees 2,500 penguins tap dancing on the iceberg. Then one of the penguins suddenly looks up and shouts across to Charlie, "You're in denial if you think you're going to be an actor again. Everyone may have forgotten you're crazy, but I haven't. Unconscious displacement," which is pretty strange. So this evaluation point supports the psychodynamic approach. Charlie is fishing while looking at a green iceberg to remind you that Fisher and Greenberg, 1996, are the researchers, and the 2,500 penguins represent the 2,500 studies of Fisher and Greenberg's meta-analysis. The penguin is shouting to represent that Fisher and Greenberg found scientific evidence for the unconscious, denial, repression, and displacement. So this evaluation point supports the psychodynamic approach because it found scientific evidence to show certain elements of it were valid. Charlie sighs and wants to get away, so he goes to the airport to fly to China to publicise the new movie, and he sits next to Elizabeth Loftus, who's a psychological genius in the field of memory. He tells her about the crazy penguin, and Loftus explains that it's not a real memory, it's a false memory implanted by Miramax, who are jealous that he signed with Universal Studios. Charlie says, "Are you sure?" And Elizabeth points out that penguins are only at the South Pole, so it can't be a real memory. So this represents that Loftus, 2003, criticised the repression, saying that repressed memories do not exist. The supposed remembered memories in therapy are actually false memories planted by other people, sometimes therapists themselves. The APA, which is the American Psychological Association, agree and say that someone who experienced abuse as a child would remember something about the event, even if they did not understand the memory. These criticisms of repression question the whole ideology of the psychodynamic approach, because the psychodynamic approach is based on helping the unconscious become conscious. Charlie feels much better and orders a drink from the cabin crew. He orders so many drinks that it takes 2 cabin crew members to actually carry them, and they are both called Sue. Charlie decides to impress Sue and Sue by doing some acting, but they hate it and are so distressed they immediately start working even harder to avoid Charlie the rest of the journey. He's not too worried though, as his new film was a huge success, and Sue just prefer cultural films. So this last part of the story is the last evaluation point, which is another criticism that identifies that the psychodynamic approach is culturally biased because it doesn't apply in non-Western cultures. Sue and Sue found that people in China avoid talking about distressing issues, whereas psychoanalysis assumes that people will want to talk freely to therapists. The psychodynamic approach is therefore an imposed ethic that may not be relevant in non-Western cultures.